Good morning and welcome to the 24th meeting of the Health and Sport Committee in 2019. We have received apologies from Sandra White, and I know all colleagues' thoughts are with her. Can I ask everyone in the room to please ensure that mobile phones are switched off or on silent and that they are not used for photography or recording of proceedings. The first item on the agenda is subordinate legislation, consideration of an affirmative instrument. As is usual with these instruments, we will hear first from the Minister and his officials, and then following that we will have a formal debate. The instrument in question is the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act 1974, Exclusions and Exceptions Scotland Amendment Order 2019. And can I welcome to the committee, with apologies for a slight delay, Joe Fitzpatrick, the Minister for Public Health, Sport and Wellbeing, who is accompanied by Claire Montgomery from the Legal Directorate, Lynn Nicholl, the Head of Openness and Learning at the Scottish Government, and David Leslie, Policy Manager at the Openness and Learning Unit. And can I invite the Minister to make a brief opening statement?
Good morning and thank you, Convener. I'm pleased to join you this morning to discuss the draft Rehabilitation of Offenders Act 1974, Exclusions and Exceptions Scotland Amendment Order 2019. Providing care with safety, compassion and dignity should be central to every health and social care interaction which happens throughout Scotland on a daily basis. However, there are rare occasions where those providing care betray that position of trust. Part 3 of the Health, Tobacco, Nicotine, etc. and Care Scotland Act 2016 contains provisions to allow the criminal justice system to hold individuals and organisations to account where they are responsible for serious and deliberate neglect or ill treatment in the course of providing health and social care services. It's important to understand that these offences are not about pursuing organisations or individuals when mistakes are made. The offences are designed to deal with those situations where someone intentionally sets out to neglect or ill-treat a person or persons in their care. There are two main offences in the 2016 Act: an offence that applies to care workers in Section 26 and an offence that applies to care providers in Section 27. These offences are intended to provide a penalty for the worst types of behaviour, such as those of the individuals convicted of the abuse at Winterbourne View Care Home in Gloucestershire, where vulnerable residents were subjected to cruel and callous behaviour by the staff who were supposed to be caring for them. Where a care worker has willfully neglected or ill-treated a person, it's important that that there is access to justice for victims. It's also important that the disclosure regime contains sufficient protections so that those with a legitimate interest, such as potential employers in the health and social care sector, can access the information they need to understand the background of a care worker who has been convicted of something so serious. The 2016 Act I mentioned made amendments to the state disclosure regime under the Police Act 1997, meaning that a spent conviction for ill-treatment or willful neglect by a care worker must be disclosed on a higher level disclosure certificate issued by Disclosure Scotland unless a sheriff orders otherwise. This draft instrument makes changes to the self-disclosure regime to provide an added layer of security. Its main effect is that a person is required to disclose their spent convictions in the context of applying for certain trusted positions or roles, such as work as a medical practitioner or work concerned with the provision of care services. They must divulge that they have a spent conviction for ill-treatment or willful neglect under Section 26 of the 2016 Act. This will be the case unless they've applied successfully to a sheriff for the spent conviction to be taken off their highest level disclosure certificate. Where no such successful application has been made, the draft order also has the effect of ensuring that it is permissible to dismiss or exclude a person from certain trusted offices, professions, occupations and employments because of their spent conviction for the offence or their failure to disclose it. This will all mean that, for example, if a person is applying for a position of trust in a health and social care organisation, the organisation will have access to the information it needs from the applicant to decide if it is appropriate to employ them, and that it will be able to take this into account. I consider that this instrument strikes a balance between protecting the public from those at risk of reoffending and also allowing those who have made mistakes in the past to become rehabilitated and make a contribution to society. Thank you very much, and obviously I'm happy to answer the committee's questions.
Thank you very much, Minister. I think it would be fair to summarise what you said, that the impact of this is to make the law consistent across the board, and that's the purpose of bringing that forward.
Yes.
Okay. Do any other members have any questions either for the Minister or for his officials? If not, we will move on to the second item on the agenda, which is the debate on this affirmative SSI, in which we have just heard from the Minister. This is a different stage. The Minister will not be answering questions. He will move the resolution and no doubt sum up as appropriate at the end. It is not a stage at which officials take part either, simply an opportunity for the committee to consider and approve or otherwise the legislation. Can I ask the Minister to move the motion?
Formally moved.
Thank you very much. Can I ask members if there are any members who wish to comment in relation to this motion? If not, does the Minister wish to add any final comment?
I think the words I would have used are the words that you used to summarise about consistency.
Thank you very much. I'm glad that we are therefore consistent. And can I ask the committee, the question is that the motion S5M19060 be approved. Are we all agreed? That is agreed. Thank you very much, and thank the Minister for your attendance. Thank you. Thank you very much. Agenda item number 3 is the NHS Serious Shortage Protocols Miscellaneous Amendments Scotland Regulations 2019, which is a negative instrument. There has been no motion to annul, and the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee has not made any comments on the instrument. We did, however, when we previously considered this, raise a question with the Government, to which we have now received a response. Can I ask if members wish to comment on that? Emma Harper.
Thank you, Convener. I would just like to comment about how I raised the issue around bioequivalence and what definition that we were going to use. And the Cabinet Secretary's letter has reassured me that we're using the European Medicines Agency's definition of bioequivalence, which then allows the drugs to be delivered or replaced, I should say. And I was also had concerns because of the bioequivalence, because in my previous work as a nurse, I had concerns about particular meds like anti-seizure meds and antipsychotics and biological medicines like Humira. So I'm satisfied that the Cabinet Secretary has given an appropriate response.
Thank you very much. Do any other members have any comments on that? If not, is the committee agreed to make no recommendations in relation to this negative instrument? That is agreed. Thank you very much. We will now move on in a moment to agenda item 4 and suspend very briefly to allow those involved in our roundtable evidence session on social prescribing to take places at the table. So suspend for a moment. Colleagues, thank you very much. We will now resume. The next item on the agenda is a roundtable evidence session on social prescribing. And in order to facilitate the freest flow of a conversation, rather than my introducing our many witnesses, I think I'll simply suggest that we quickly go round the table and introduce ourselves. I'm Lewis MacDonald, MSP, the convener of the committee.
I'm Katie Walter, GP Inverness, and involved in a number of projects around social prescribing.
Emma Harper, I'm MSP for South Scotland region.
Claire Thurble, Health and Wellbeing Specialist from the Public Health Department in Dumfries and Galloway.
George Adam, Paisley's MSP.
Richard Davison, Professor of Exercise Physiology, University of West of Scotland, and representing Observatory for Sport in Scotland.
Miles Briggs, Conservative MSP for Lothian and Conservative Health and Sports spokesman.
Flora Jackson, Health Improvement Manager for Physical Activity at NHS Health Scotland.
Kirsty McNabb, the CEO of Scottish Sports Futures, third sector organisation working with vulnerable communities using sport as our tool.
Alex Cole-Hamilton, Liberal Democrat Health Spokesperson.
Kim Atkinson, the Chief Executive of the Scottish Sports Association, the membership organisation for the governing bodies for the different sports in Scotland.
Bob Doris, SNP MSP for Glasgow, Maryhill and Springburn.
William Bird, a GP for 30 years, involved with health walks and setting up for social prescribing, and also CEO of Intelligent Health.
I'm David Stewart, I'm a Labour MSP for the Highlands and Islands region.
Martin Heyman, representing Table Tennis Scotland. We run our community table tennis programme around Scotland.
Brian Whittle, South of Scotland, MSP and party spokesman on wellbeing and sport.
Corinne Yola, I'm Senior Lecturer in Psychology at Abertay University, and I do research on dance for health and well-being.
David Torrance, MSP, Kirkcaldy constituency. Yes, Scottish champion.
Excellent. I'm sure it won't be the only bid for fame in the course of this morning's session, but welcome to all our witnesses. Can I start off, and I guess as an indication, simply to say that we want this to be free-flowing. Please indicate, though, to me and speak through the chair in order to achieve some structure to our conversation. But can I start off by asking any of the witnesses who would like to comment whether the concept of social prescribing itself is the right one? Is there a risk of restraining or restricting its application by using the word prescribe? Is there a risk of medicalising it, or are we all talking about the same thing when we talk about social prescribing, and what is it we should be talking about? Who would like to start? William Bird.
I mean, I think being involved with social prescribing for so long as a GP, I'm totally welcoming it. I think it's fantastic. It really is a fantastic move in the right direction. But always, when you go in the right direction, there are dangers. And I think one of the main dangers that we will find is that we do medicalise it more. The very word, as you say, social prescribing. It's very linear. It's very hard to scale up. And the biggest worry I've got, which I think we will discuss, is it takes responsibility away from people who are already doing this kind of work, because they see social prescribing as a conduit to go through all the work which is generally being done by communities, being done by primary care units and everyone else. So the danger is that we'll get experts called link workers who will take on the role, very successfully hopefully, but it will take it away from everyone else taking that responsibility.
Thank you very much. Any other thoughts? I see a few nodding heads. Yes, Katie.
So I'd absolutely share William's enthusiasm and concerns. I think one of the things that I really liked reading all the submissions is a consistency across the board, that there's a recognition that this is a really good move, but we're in a place of a weak evidence base that's evolving as we speak. So it's very difficult to go to adopt a lot of strategies which rely on something where the evidence base is still evolving. I think for me the problem with the term social prescribing is that at one level I socially prescribe every single day when I talk to people about walking as a means of increasing their levels of physical activity. And for me, that feels as much as social prescribing as actually somebody with a lot of healthcare needs, who needs a lot of support, who needs a lot of hand-holding. So I think there is really a tiered, the term masks a tiered level of different interventions that are needed depending on people's needs.
Thank you very much. Yes, Richard Davis.
Yeah, I agree with the comments that have been put forward so far. I think there are obviously risks in terms of even capacity to deliver, which is one of the things that I raised in my return. I think there's issues about having the key workers trained to be able to deal with, as Katie mentioned, the range of problems that come their way, and how to effectively, in my way I see it as a triage operation, to be able to signpost to appropriate services. So that is, and we can only look at it as one weapon in our toolkit against physical inactivity. Go back to one of Mick Williams' points about medicalisation. In fact, I think we could be radical here and actually bring medicine much more into everyday life. So why do we not have GP surgeries in community centres, leisure centres, where the exercise is taking place? Why do we not see that physical activity, sport and exercise is much more, mainstream? It's part of what is the NHS.
Atkinson.
Thanks, Commissioner. I guess echoing some of the points that colleagues have made, I think there's I think social prescribing, there are many opportunities for it, as our members would have identified. I think recognition for existing systems is, I think, huge. So as the committee have heard us talk before, there are 13,000 sports clubs. There's 900,000 people who are already members of sports clubs. So there's a lot of people who are already being active, who are kind of doing their own social prescribing, as Dr. Bird was saying. But again, are we adequately supporting those? So hopefully a subject that we will come back to. The point that Richard was making, there are some really good examples. So again, the committee before, I think, have been out to Atlantis Leisure over in Open, where they operate a very similar system, where the partnership between Atlantis Leisure and the local GP, where actually the programme run by Atlantis Leisure sits in the GP practice. So there are lots of sets of examples where things have worked really successfully, and that seems to be a particularly good example. I think the notion of social prescribing, to answer your question, convener, the idea that it's a prescription, I think, is quite interesting. So there's a notion I think people have that you get your prescription in it and you walk along to the pharmacist and it's free. And certainly I think for those that are delivering, particularly across the voluntary sector, so not just from sport and physical activity, but more broadly across the voluntary sector, the money doesn't then follow that prescription. So there's a notion of a prescription there that I think there's inequitable if we're talking about this being such an opportunity that we're maybe not treating that in the same way. But I do also think our understanding is that 4% of the population understand the Chief Medical Officer's guidelines. So is there a perception of the public themselves in saying, well, I'm expecting to go away with a medical prescription, but I don't know the Chief Medical Officer's guidelines, I don't know the benefits of being active, and you're almost kind of seen to be pawning me off to some kind of other activity. Now, that's not the reality, but is there a perception that we could help to change if more people knew the benefits of being active and the Chief Medical Officer's guidelines about why that is so important and can be so beneficial?
Okay. Brian?
I agree as well with what has been said so far. What my interest is in the social prescribing is to look at the opportunities that arise from it that can address some of the points that have already been mentioned. So, for example, starting focus on social prescribing and linking it to further evidence-based research that can be culminated together, that can kind of, while the social prescribing is rolling on, can actually advance the evidence base while it's there and further increase. And also kind of to make movement and physical activity more mainstream, to kind of link social prescribing with the experience that the communities who offer activities and the link workers and the GPs work together on understanding that is more theoretically driven of what is missing, that people don't start moving more, kind of the enjoyment of the movement that is kind of lost in wide areas of the population. So while the trajectory of the social prescribing is happening, to link funding that goes into it also with getting more evidence that is also theory driven and working more in collaborative projects to build up on the expertise that is there and the experience.
Thank you very much. Yes, Flora Jackson.
Thank you. Yeah, I very much echo much of what colleagues have also said. Just really, I suppose my perspective is that I see social prescribing as part of a continuum, and there's elements of work that need to be undertaken within the healthcare system in terms of the knowledge and skills and behaviours of our health professionals. Their awareness of the current physical activity guidelines we know is not as strong as we would perhaps like, so there is definitely a lot of work to be done there to support and upskill our health professionals. But equally, there is a risk that as good as our health professionals become at providing physical activity brief advice and brief interventions, there's a risk that we could potentially actually overburden our third sector partners out with the NHS. So there's certainly, we need to be mindful of, within this world of integration of health and social care, how we strike that balance of funding across both elements.
Okay, thank you very much. Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to the panellists. I think it was really interesting listening to the initial responses of everybody to your question around what social prescribing is. And, you know, obviously my preference is for sport. I think everybody in the chamber thinks that my solution to every problem is go for a run. And I don't think it's far away from that, to be quite honest. But what I found was quite interesting there was we're talking about sport. Where does art and drama and music and other activities like that fall into social prescribing? Because, you know, the impact specifically around mental health issues sit within just as easily within those categories as everything else. I don't know what the panel think of that. And also, looking at social prescribing, to me, it's about understanding what your offer is in the local community and how we link up with the local community offer that is there. How do we do that? And that which will be different in every community. And it can't be enough just for a doctor or a clinician to prescribe. We have to work a pathway that allows them to engage. So how do we do that?
Much. The focus today, clearly, given our witnesses, is primarily on sport and physical activity, but you are right that there are other forms of social prescribing. Kirsty McNabb.
Similar to Brian, I think sport can absolutely change lives, and that's as an organisation what we absolutely believe in. To pick up on Flora's point, we do as a third sector need money to be able to do this properly. We are doing a lot of work just now which is actually based on what people are telling us is a real need around mental health. We've got young person led mental health programmes, and we're having to constantly, we're working with SAMH, the lead organisation for mental health, and we're using sport as our tool. And the constant challenge for us is having to fight the case to use our evidence base, and we have really robust monitoring and evaluation. It's something I think that the third sector are actually very good at. But we're constantly having to prove our worth, so we spend a lot of time trying to get funding in for projects which actually will alleviate some of the pressure to CAMHS. You know, the referral rate to CAMHS has risen by 2,000. There's 2,000 young people waiting on that waiting list extra, which has made it rise to 10,000. So absolutely, as a concept, we completely want to be in this space. There's obviously an argument around it being called social connectedness. I don't think, you know, just calling it social prescription, I think is fine. But we need to make sure that there is that money into third sector to enable it to work.
Martin Haven.
Yes, I guess I'm looking at this and coming to this from the perspective of being a sporting organisation that in some ways is catering for a lot of older people, particularly coming in and engaging in sport. The big element of that and the biggest impact that has is the social engagement. It's participation in a social environment. It's almost the teas and coffees and the blether that's involved around the sport is almost as valuable to participants as the physical activity itself. And I think the combination of the two is incredibly important. What we find as a sport is that we have almost no link or engagement with the health provision and the health service in terms of referral process. Some of that may well be going on at local level, but at a large scale, it's not. And I think I'm very keen to see how our sport can develop and work with the NHS and health providers to provide that community-based activity. There are a couple of things, and funding is one that has been mentioned both by Kim and Kirsty, and I think that's important, where somebody who goes to the GP, they get a prescription, they get their medication, there is no cost attached to them. They're encouraged to join a local sporting group where participants have to pay. And so there is an expectation that, yes, they're referred to it, but there's a cost attached to them, and it's not huge. table tennis classes are £3 or £4 maximum, sometimes less than that. So it's not a huge cost, but there is a barrier there. And I think what we all need to look at is what are the barriers that we are placing between individuals who need physical activity and the groups, community groups that are in a position to support and provide that. And certainly cost is one of them.
So is it the case that we've heard about the evidence base, we've heard about accessibility, is it the case that although everyone agrees these are very good things, there is simply no mechanism or no joining up that allows that to happen?
I was just about to say exactly what you said in your summary there. I think generally in the room we all believe that social prescribing or something of this nature is a good idea. I suppose the problem is that it's the, if you like, the underpinning evidence that we have, and I think Katie started with this, that says what is the best approach. And I'll put my hand up as an exercise scientist myself and say we've been very good at proving the efficacy of exercise. We know that it helps people's health. Ultimately, we're all trying to improve population health here. This is the objective, take the strain off the NHS. However, what we have also seen in the research is that when we look at that over the longer term, so 6, 12 weeks intervention, a prescription, whatever, works, but in the long term, it doesn't work. It does seem to be slightly more successful within clubs, and I'll come back to some of Martin's points about, I think it's the social context is really important there, and it links to something that Brian said, that, that there is that social, psychological benefit that comes from that, and it's a bit more of a cohesion. So I think that's one of the solutions, but we really don't have the underpinning research evidence to suggest this is the best policy, this is the best route, the best methodology.
Claire Thurber.
Yes, I probably agree with a lot of my colleagues around the table around the fact that the evidence is emerging. It's not quite there yet, but it's coming. There's a lot of kind of work going right across Scotland. I absolutely agree that it absolutely has to be a whole systems approach to social prescribing, if that's the concept that we're using. It has to be that we're looking at the individuals at the centre of it, that we're working with the individuals to understand their needs, that we're looking at that within the communities that they're placed in. If you look at from a rural area, we don't have the same infrastructure, so we have to kind of look at different approaches to what we're taking forward. But we also have to be looking at how we're making sure the infrastructure around the person to make this kind of maximise those opportunities going forward. So that's working with our health and social care staff to make sure they that are absolutely have got the skills, the training, the abilities to kind of work with individuals to signpost our link workers. It's making sure that our link workers have the adequate training to make sure that working through those health behaviour change interventions, but it's also making sure that our communities are there and are supported, that they're actually welcoming, have that opportunity to accept people around and our inequalities, etc. around about it. So we've actually been working on that in Dumfries and Galloway, and we've been taking forward a lot of the looking at the evidence base from our colleagues around the table, but also about the engagement with our communities to make sure that we can try and get an infrastructure that absolutely supports that process going forward.
Thank you very much. Kim Atkinson, then.
The World Health Organization's definition of health, I think, brings together a lot of what people are talking about, that it's the mental, the physical, but also the social. And I think, again, exactly as Martin and Richard were saying, that the club aspect of that is particularly important. To answer part of Brian's question, a lot of the work we do as the Scottish Sports Association is with colleagues across the voluntary sector through SCVO, the Scottish Volunteering Forum, and with my own hat on, I'm Vice Chair of ACOSVO, the Association of Chief Officers of Scottish Voluntary Organisations. And I actually think a lot of the challenges and barriers that Brian was raising across the voluntary sector exist regardless if you're sport and physical activity or if you're other sets of organisations. I think the access to resource is a continuing issue. If we're talking about this as fundamentally being a lifestyle and a behaviour change, the idea of people being referred to 12-week programmes and assuming that you're going to make lifestyle or behaviour change in that period, but also across the vast majority of the voluntary sector where you're talking about 1 year investment, something I know that is regularly discussed at the cross-party group on volunteering. When you've got organisations that are looking to justify their own resource and are monitoring against their own resource on a 1 year funding cycle and expecting them to deliver the best efforts for their staff to be as fully engaged and focused as they can be is simply unfair. But again, it is a cross-sector issue across the whole voluntary sector. I think the access to facilities, so one of the major barriers that our members talk about in any situation, but certainly has come up at the committee before, is access to resources. They're expensive and they can't get in. Now, there's no question there is a significant knock-on effect of local authority budgets, and again, I know convener something that the committee's looked at before, but the cost of facilities is too high. We have clubs saying they cannot get in because the facilities are either too expensive or they're closed. And yet we're saying, go because we know the clubs are the best thing. Go because we know that the access to volunteering and chatting with other people is really important. So that keeps coming back from our members as being a significant barrier. As I think again picks up on what Martin was talking about, volunteering isn't free. There's this notion that people are volunteering and it's free. Well, their giving of their time is free, but the access to the training and support that Flora talked about takes time. Again, something I know that comes up regularly at the cross-party group on volunteering. The support for that network is not free, and we need to invest in that and try and make sure that those people are supported. On the flip side, and I know something that is, ironically, apologies, keep plugging it, coming up at the next meeting of the cross-party group on volunteering as part of the wider Scottish Volunteering Forum, we've been doing some work with Volunteer Scotland on the health and wellbeing benefits of volunteering in its own right. So I know the Scottish Volunteering Forum made a submission themselves, but some great evidence about the benefits of volunteering itself to health and wellbeing, why that's so important. Interestingly, in addition to that, it then talks about the further benefits of sport and physical activity within that, not just to volunteering itself by the fact that more people from more challenged backgrounds or live in areas of deprivation volunteer in sport than do in other areas, but also, obviously, if you're volunteering in sport, you're then furthering other people's physical activity. So I think a lot of the barriers and the opportunities, whether that's across the arts and culture more broadly, are actually quite similar, and I think that, again, would be useful for the committee to help us to work through some of those opportunities and challenges.
Thank you very much. Emma Harper.
Thank you, Convener. Just to pick up a quick supplementary, Claire, you mentioned rural challenges, and I know Claire because we've worked together in Dumfries and Galloway related to some of these issues. But can you just outline what the rural challenges are versus urban? There'll be urban challenges, I'm sure everybody will have as well, because it is interesting to highlight the challenges in rural areas, not alone just transportation to places that might offer some kind of sporting activity.
Absolutely. So rural challenges, well, today, transport, absolutely. Just even trying to get up here. So transport is obviously a huge issue. The availability of what's actually in your community can be a huge issue. It can be, for instance, depending on the person's circumstances, it can be the stigma around their circumstances and being able to access what's actually within their community can be a huge issue. The availability of choice can be a huge issue. We could probably run through a whole host of different things, but for me what's actually fundamental here is about how we actually work within our communities, about what's available within our communities, and make sure that people are connecting with those communities and even working with the communities to grow the assets that are absolutely fundamentally there. So choice might not be there in terms of the kind of different aspects that can be available to what urban areas will have, but we do have a lot of beautiful landscape within our region as well, and it's about how we can actually value the kind of opportunities around making sure that people can use green exercise, the space, just a simple walk, and try to take that forward as well. But that also comes in barriers potentially with confidence, self-esteem, in terms of working with individuals to kind of overcome those barriers and taking that forward as well.
Good. Flora Jackson.
Thank you. I would just like to highlight there's actually an exceptional piece of work which Claire's been very modest because she's done some great work in NHS Dumfries and Galloway, and we've seen social prescribing frameworks emerge south of the border that we may want to look at, but I would first and foremost recommend actually the work that Claire has done in Dumfries and Galloway in drafting the outline of what a social prescribing framework looks like. Okay, within an NHS Dumfries and Galloway context, but I'd say that's of greater relevance and much more succinct to a Scottish context than other models that I've seen. So I would recommend that we have sight of that if possible.
Your answer, Katie Walter.
I think there is a risk of compounding two different things. I think we're talking a lot about social prescribing, and we know that the reason that we support social prescribing, we think it's a good thing, is because it's a way of addressing some of the social determinants of health and health inequalities. So that's sort of the foundations underneath social prescribing. We're then also talking about physical activity and how to increase people's levels of physical activity. And although there's a lot of overlap, they're not exactly the same thing. And actually what may be the right thing in terms of addressing social inequalities, and rurality comes into that, and we know that social inequalities are often compounded by rurality factors, might actually be look quite different if we're looking just at how we increase people's physical activity levels. If we were just increasing people's physical activity levels and we were talking in the broader sense about social prescribing, about realistic medicine brought out to the people, to society, rather than just how we practice medicine, that might look quite different, because that might actually not look like an intervention at a health level at all. It might actually look at an intervention at a transport and infrastructure level, because actually you might get much more bang for your buck in making our cities and roads, and not just our urban areas, but our rural areas as well, accessible for walkers and cyclists safely. I'll just give you a tiny vignette around this. One of the projects I've been involved with is called Wheelness, and it's been running now for a couple of years in Inverness, and the second year has had a real focus on disabilities. One of our participants lives rurally in a small community. He uses 2 sticks to walk. He has really quite precarious mobility. He relies entirely on public transport and essentially 2 buses a day in his area. His kids stay several miles away. So to get to them, he's reliant upon public transport that doesn't really deliver what he needs. And he has now got an electric e-tricycle, which has given him mobility, which allows him to get from A to B, which he arrives at his kid's school looking like quite the coolest thing in town. But what he hasn't got is a safe infrastructure to do that on. Because although he's in a rural area and there's a lot of focus on safe cycling and walking in urban areas, that is also a problem in rural areas. So I think, for me, the physical activity social prescribing is a very, very broad one. And actually that is the responsibility of every single health professional on the shop floor, whether they're GPs, whether they're receptionists, it's everybody. And that is a matter for Public Health Scotland when it comes into being as its first task to really broadcast that message and to train our staff, because one of my real bugbears is we're not trained in this. If you look across my practice, we're a large urban practice. I think 2 of us have done formal behaviour change training. And actually, we're the people delivering that message, we're the people having those conversations. I think it's a really good time to be having these conversations at the moment, because there's a change in climate. People want something different. Realistic medicine has actually unleashed us as health professionals to start to think differently about how we deliver healthcare. But there's another bit that's coming into that, and that's about climate change and environmental concerns. Our head of pharmacy in NHS Highland was in discussion with me 2 weeks ago, came to the practice to talk about how we could work better together to demedicalise things, to try and deprescribe, to try and actually think differently about how we deliver healthcare. And for me, that signals that there's a huge attitude shift across the board, not just within the health structure, but actually at a community level as well, in the conversations that I have with patients who want to start to do something for the environment as well. I think the time is ripe to be having that.
Thank you very much. Martin Heyman.
Yeah, thanks very much. I wanted to come back on Emma's issue on rural activity. Accessibility for sport is and making it as easy as possible for people to get to is absolutely critical. We've done a little bit of research on our participants, and it's very clear that the distance from where they live to the venue is absolutely critical in terms of participation, and vastly more so when you get into areas of higher deprivation. If the venue isn't within 1 to 2 miles of where people live, they won't participate. In more affluent areas, that distance can go up to 5 or 10 miles. They're quite happy to jump in the car and travel. So if we're looking at getting people more active in more deprived communities, we've got to make the sport, the physical activity opportunities as close and as local as possible. And in rural areas, for a sport like ours, yes, it is possible within a small village hall, church hall, school hall to set up and get small groups going. And actually in Dumfries and Galloway, there are some phenomenal examples where local communities have got together and in those communities are playing table tennis. It's very, very effective. So I think one of the things we've really got to look at is how do we make this as accessible as possible, and look at let's look at all stages about what are the barriers that we're putting up that are actually stopping people participating, and let's work really hard at taking down those barriers and making this as easy as possible for somebody to cross the threshold and get involved. Because when they do, in the right social, fun environment where it is clearly enjoyable, they'll stick at it. And that will go long beyond the 6 weeks, the 12 weeks of a participation. If it's fun as well as physically active, they'll stick at it.
Thank you very much. William Bird.
Just to pick up on what Katie said, actually, we've got three big problems which are unresolved. And if we look at the revolutions of healthcare from from a public health in the 19th century to modern medicine, which we've developed hugely, to now personalised health, which is going to be very much more genomics and individualised health. But there's a fourth revolution that's going to sort out the three big problems, and Katie mentioned two of them. One of them is climate change, the other is health inequalities, and the third one is going to be the whole aspect of diseases we can't treat in medicine. So we can't treat diabetes, we can only allay it. We can't treat cardiovascular disease. We can't treat dementia. There are lots of these things are developing where we're just holding the symptoms at bay. And to get to the core of that is going back to childhood and to going back to the whole social fabric of society. So in a way, we can't see social prescribing as on its own. It's part of a much bigger picture of going right back to the structure, because children, we can pick up their cardiovascular disease and their hypertension starting at the age of 6 and 7, and that is where the problems really begin. So we have to see social prescribing not just at the other end but through a whole life course. The other thing is scale. Social prescribing will never be able to deal at scale with the problem we've got. You know, we're not dealing with just tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. We're talking about millions of people have to be embodied in this. And if we're looking, and as Katie said, you know, physical activity promotion and social prescribing are two different things. Walking is the one way that would actually get that scale. So I totally, you know, around here we've got some fantastic organisations, volunteering, clubs, absolutely essential for the fabric of society, and we need to build those up. But to actually get the scale, we need to do the unstructured activities. That's a mum and a dad taking their children to the park. That's someone walking to school for the first time and actually talking to their child. That's two older people perhaps going for a walk themselves. And they can only do that if the infrastructure is in place, and that's obviously one of the other aspects. So I'd see social prescribing as part of the solution, but also as a segue to a bigger revolution, which is when we get the social movement, where everyone takes responsibility, not just left, and that mum taking her older mother and her child onto a walk is that activity leader, and that's what she's been given, that responsibility. But she takes it on because she wants that social movement to address those three major problems we've got.
David Stewart.
Thank you. Can I just touch on the points that Dr. Walter and Dr. Bird have made about the wider issues of social prescribing, perhaps to bring in the political aspect of this, not in a party political way, but to ask some wider issues. So, for example, when budgets have been looked at in this place, there's been some argument that the transport budget should have a greater proportion spent on active travel. Some have argued, not necessarily me, but some have argued particularly that should come out of the roads budget. But a couple of points that I would like to make around that is all fine and well, but also we've got to look at safety, because it's fine talking about active travel, but if you're in a very disadvantaged area, there is sometimes issues around safety. There's also wider issues about how we design our towns, our cities, and indeed our rural areas. And also I've been quite concerned, particularly when I was on the Environment Committee, around the whole issue of toxicity in atmosphere. So, for example, in very disadvantaged areas, it tends to be young, developing people or older people who are more liable to have the real problems of a very toxic atmosphere. And that's why I'm very enthusiastic about low emission zones and looking very carefully about issues like park and ride systems. So even though we can't necessarily get modal shift from people who have to drive in, if we have a decent park and ride system, we can at least have electric buses, if you take the Inverness example, maybe from the Cally Thistle Stadium into the main structures in Inverness like Rigmore and some of the bigger aspects there. So it's about what politicians can do, but maybe we need to listen to professionals around this table about how we can design our policies and have social prescribing when it comes to designing transport transport policies to make sure that we have safer cities, which have less toxic atmospheres, which encourage people to take out of their cars, and those who don't have cars, we maybe need to develop safer, more developed municipal bus services, which are certainly my lot are very keen in developing. So I'd be interested to hear particularly what Dr Walter has to say on that, because I thought she had a very good article in the P&J yesterday on that aspect.
I'll bring Katie Walter back in a moment, but first of all, I'll hear from Corinne Jola, I think had signalled, and then Brian Whittle.
Yes, since I wanted to make my comment, a lot in that direction has been raised as well. And I wanted to kind of emphasize what has been mentioned with the whole system approach as well, like Claire said and Katie mentioned. And also in relation to what's been mentioned here by Brian, Martin and Richard, like the social component that is really important. It was actually also mentioned in the walks by Dr. Bird. That I know that this is kind of the meeting on looking at health and sport, but also having this consideration of using a whole system approach for social prescribing. It would be maybe missed on having the right medication if we say, well, this is social prescribing for health and sport. We are not looking at cultural activities or kind of other cross sectors with transport, what needs to be done there. So I think as well, like it seems most of us have kind of agreed upon that it's important when discussing social prescribing that it's not within just one sector. And what was also mentioned was kind of, in addition to the social component, that's really important, how can we guarantee sustainability? And with doing mostly research on Dawn's health and well-being, I was actually feeling quite honored to be invited to health and sport, because dance as a physical activity is often kind of doubted and discussed, and also suffers a lot of stigma as to whether it's useful, it's a sufficient physical activity or not. But it really is one of the activities that has been shown to increase sustainability the highest when they do studies, so that people actually continue doing it even though the study is finished, the intervention, and people from the control group actually engage in the activity that the other group got, which was the dancing group. So this just as an example that an activity that has many different elements to it, like being outside, is not just a physical activity, it's being outside with other people. Or dancing, it's not just a physical activity, it's with other people and it's creative as well, so that the expressive component is there as well. That we really have to look at the system as a whole approach. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'll maybe ask Katie Walter to respond briefly to David Stewart, and then I'll come to Brian Whittle.
So, I'm not a politician. I devolve my responsibility to make difficult decisions to my politicians. That's what we do with the civic journey, isn't it? And I sit here and I think, wow, I wouldn't do your job because it's a difficult job, because there are difficult decisions to be made, and there are decisions to be made that are going to cheese some people off, that's for sure. But I guess if we go back to the vision, and I was really, I was really encouraged in these dark times where everything is actually pretty dismal out there in the news and what's happening in the world, to actually go back and just read the Scottish Government's vision about physical activity. And if you look at the principles that are embedded there, they're really good principles. It's really hard not to agree with them. It's about how do we translate that into reality. And one of those principles is about better joint working at a high level. And I think for me that's absolutely key. This is a time of absolute opportunity. We're revisiting the National Transport Strategy. This is a key time for health and transport to actually come together. I've been working over the last few years on a number of projects, which are all health projects. They're all funded by Transport Scotland. And for me, that shows that there is somewhere a disconnect in how we're thinking about these projects at a high level. So I would say, I think we've got the right agreement of the right vision that we all agree on. It's how we deliver that, and how we deliver that in an evidence-based fashion. I think it's an exciting time at one level to be. I'm very glad I live in Scotland, because I think that we're sitting here having a meaningful debate about how we actually translate that into a reality. So it's going to be scary. As we said at the beginning, the evidence base is evolving. We may get this incredibly wrong, but actually if we invest in infrastructure, it's difficult to get things wrong with infrastructure, because that infrastructure will last several generations. So that would be my plug.
Thank you very much. Brian Whittle and then Richard next.
Thank you, Convener. Again, just listening to everybody's conversation, I think what strikes me is that we understand that in terms of health, if we are more physically active, if we eat better and we are included in society, we as a nation will be healthier. Yet we're still determined to try and continue to prove that, rather than just accept that as a logical step. And to move on from what Dave said and others have said here, in terms of budget seems to be the issue. So what I was going to say was that we've mentioned transport, we've mentioned health. What about education as a budget? What about the local council budgets? And to me, I think we're far too focused on the health budgets over there and the education budgets over there and transport budgets over there. I've heard so much in education that is health related. I've heard so much in transport that is health related, and vice versa. So I wonder, with that in mind, whether or not we're thinking that the way in which this place budgets needs to change. It needs to evolve to be a bit more fluid, to allow, which would then allow the financing of social prescribing within that framework. I wonder what the panel think of that.
Can I take Richard Davison? I suspect you'll want to add that question to the points you were in any case making, and then follow that with Kirsty McNabb.
I think if you just try and take it back to the whole concept of social prescribing for a second, and somebody coming to a GP, they're normally coming for a reason anyway, so they're unwell. And I'm sure there's an awful lot of those people that, if we talk in behaviour change terms, that they would be pre-contemplators, so they wouldn't actually be at that stage of readiness to partake in any physical activity. And that's a challenge, because those are the most difficult people to try and transform and get them to be active. The research, actually, we don't have that research, because normally when you recruit for research, you get the worried well. So they're already contemplators. So that's a huge challenge that, I'd be interested to get the GP comments on that. Of course, they come back also in terms of these people on the whole are likely to be, if we look at participation rates and things like Park Run, Jog Scotland, they've soared. The last 10 years have absolutely soared. But I bet you, I don't have the exact evidence, but if you look at the socioeconomic status of that group, they'll be much higher. So we have a segment of the population who are unhealthy, low socioeconomic groups that we need to reach. And I'll sort of look at Kim now and go, that's a challenge also for sporting governing bodies, is how do we lower the threshold for entry into those activities for those types of people, because those are the ones that we really need to reach.
Thank you. Kirsty McNabb.
Which is quite a nice point for me to come in, actually, because organisationally that's the people that we are reaching. And to go back to your point, Katie, our staff who work right across Scotland are trained in behaviour change, and I think there's a job to do for us all as colleagues to collectively recognise the value in each contribution. There was a recent Audit Scotland report that highlighted that many healthcare professionals still have a reluctance to refer to third sector, and whether that's about awareness, and I absolutely put my hands up and say, actually we don't engage as well as we could with healthcare professionals at a local level. We're really good at engaging with CAMHS, Barnardo's, social work, school education, as well as with our sport clubs to try and support. We do the early intervention and we support transition. So I think that was the point I wanted to make, that it's great we're all here and we're having this debate, but we've all proved our worth, and we have to work better together as sectors, really understanding the value that each has to play. I think Scotland is such a small place, and it's actually a bit of a jigsaw. There's so many people with so many strengths already highlighting the benefit of being physically active. We're working with those hard to reach, easy to ignore people in areas of deprivation. We've got really people who are very well trained in behaviour change, and what we sometimes struggle to do is actually get referrals into our programmes, so that's still a bit of a challenge. Just wanted to highlight that point.
George.
Yes, thank you, Convener. It's been great listening to this today, and one of the things that's been a bugbear of mine, I think Martin Heyman brought it up and Professor Davison brought it up as well, was the fact that in areas of higher deprivation, it's difficult to get people involved. Now, with me, I make no apology that all roads lead to Paisley, but basically Fergusley Park is year after year looked as an area of ultimate deprivation in the whole of Scotland. Now, I'm fed up actually saying that and hearing that and talking about that. And I think we need to look at something more radical. And it's like what Brian already said. It's getting everything together: health, sport, education. You know, putting them all under one place. Now, in Fergusley Park, we have a professional football club that is part of the community, does a lot of good work in the community. It's got a community trust in St Mirren FC. They do a lot of good work, but why don't we take that to the next level? Why don't? There is ground round there. Why do we not give the community and find out what the community wants? As opposed to doing what councils and everything did in the past, is just build a big shiny new building and say, there you go, that cost X amount of £1 million. But find what the community wants, because at the end of the day, the important thing is, if it is St Mirren FC, believe it or not, in Paisley, there's more likelihood of people engaging with that group in that sports club. And if I'm talking about a multi-sports kind of complex being based there, not just because UWS ain't going to invest in sports facilities now. So if they all work together in the community, we can find, it's not a case of the funding being the issue, it's just being clever with the funding and actually saying that this works and finding a way to make sure we do it. Surely it's not beyond the wit of us all to be able to actually do that and get ourselves into that place. I know I've been hitting my head off of that brick wall for about the past 5 years, and the council backed the idea at one point, but then turned it into a sports complex, forgetting the actual main issue wasn't the actual kicking a ball, heading a ball, pushing a ball, or running about. It's actually getting people involved. You know, that was the main thing. And, you know, so how do we get ourselves into that place, and how do we start debating that, not just us here, but out there in the real world?
Thank you very much. Can I take Martin Heyman and then David Stewart and then Kevin?
Yeah, I'd like to, on your how do you get people active in more deprived communities, draw to the committee's attention the phenomenal success of table tennis in Drumchapel. As an example, where the sports centre there is the heart of table tennis actually in Scotland. It's the most successful of clubs in Scotland, operating out of a building that the community took over. I think it's now 25 years ago. Still phenomenally successful. 300 plus people playing table tennis on a regular basis in one of the more deprived communities in Scotland. So, but it is social as well. There's a big social element to the success of that. But it's still very, very difficult. Talking to the people who run, getting people through the door for the first time is hard. And I had a description from the chairman there of the walk that the participants need to make past the bouquets, past where they pick up their methadone. You know, these are all the things that stop them coming through the door. But when we can get them through the door, they enjoy it. It's fun. They're engaged. And that makes a difference. And you know, so I think there is a real opportunity to getting the right facilities and the right activities embedded within those communities. And I think Drumchapel needs to be seen as a place where it has most definitely worked.
I guess what's interesting is to understand why things work in some places and not in others. David Stewart.
Thank you. Just a quick add-on in George Adam's point, I think made a lot of sense about the role of football and social prescribing. And we all know around this table that older men, particularly in disadvantaged areas, are a very difficult to reach group. And if I could again do an advert for my own team in Cali Thistle, what they've done is, first of all, they've done regular blood pressure checks at football games, which is very important, but also the walking football, which David Torrance will be a star at, I'm sure, is very effective. And I went with the presiding officer when he was doing his tour recently, and one of the participants had dementia and was a regular user at walking football and really developed from it. So I think there is a social prescribing role for sport in the sense that that's a good way in and a good signpost. So I would certainly flag that up in future work that we're going to do in the committee.
Thank you very much. Kim Atkinson and Kitty Walter.
I think one of the opportunities for social prescribing is to bring together the different sets of strands. So we've all talked a little bit about a holistic approach, and I'm sure we'll come back to that. But I do think part of it comes back to the budgeting that Brian was talking about. So often budgeting, you know, and indeed I think the formal national performance framework, I think the new national performance framework hopefully makes that a little bit easier. But, you know, we operate, as you say, it's health, it's education, it's transport, it's planning. And those things like sport and physical activity, which could be seen as budget lines themselves, but are also vehicles that weave across actually find it incredibly difficult to demonstrate the budget call across pretty much any area. And we've said to this committee before, if you pick a small budget like sport and ask, and find another one that contributes across so many different sets of agendas, I'll be challenged to find one that I think contributes to more. But those vehicle type opportunities to demonstrate the breadth of those outcomes, I think is really difficult. I think George's point about where there's a political will, there's a way, and I think that's very fair, not just at national government level, but at local government level as well, which I think is fundamental. Planning came up very briefly earlier when we were talking about a holistic approach. Our members had a really interesting conversation when the National Planning Framework 3 came in previous Scottish planning policy. There's a huge opportunity as we're now looking at NPF 4 to say, actually, what does that look like? So picking up on some of the things that Katie was talking about, as you say, as connectors, but also environments where people want to be active, where you actually want to walk, where you're not walking beside a road, but that it can connect communities in a way that Richard was talking about. I know Katie also mentioned training for colleagues. I know that there was a pilot a good number of years ago that talked about GPs asking a question. So we're not just asking about alcohol and smoking. We were also asking about how physically active we are. I'm not sure that's still happening as a conversation. So I think that would be a really interesting question from a GP point of view as well. In picking up the conversation about walking, without question, walking is the most equitable in that sense, but certainly I know research also has shown that walking can also be a pathway. So again, our members at Scottish Golf talked about, again, a number of people who've been through walking pathways and say, well, actually, I now feel able to take up golf, or I'd like to take up bowling. So it's important as an equitable opportunity, but it's also important as a starting point. But that breadth of opportunity is so important. Our members at Scottish Disability Sport certainly reported that 47% of people thought they would be more active if there were more opportunities for them to be active. So let's not forget that's important. And when we're talking about modelling, I know Flora was talking earlier about Claire's example. How do we know the kinds of opportunities that people are interested in? So the Sports Clubs for Health document that we referred to in our response does a bit of modelling and saying, actually, if these are the kinds of health issues that you have, these are the types of sporting and physical activity endeavours you should be trying to do that will provide benefit. Surely we can start that as a modelling and then say, actually, what does that then mean in your local area where there are different opportunities for you to be active, and where does that pathway lead potentially from walking into saying, great, are you aware there's a local table tennis club? Are you aware that actually there's a golf club? Are you aware that there's a lot happening in bowling? I think the other part on the budget system is sport is seen as a cost and physical activity is seen as a cost. And we're not in an environment and a culture where we see it as an investment, which I think is partly where you were going with that, Brian, and very much, I think, supporting your point there, David, around as an investment. So we've got really good examples of the health budget being moved into active schools and the huge success of the active schools programme. Similarly, from transport into the active travel budget, I don't know that we've seen the same movement of prevention into the health budget that we've seen in active travel. But also we've seen the justice money move into cashback for communities, where again, there've been so many sets of successes, but again, we haven't seen that then replicated. So going back to George's point about how do you do that at scale, well, if you've got a concept and you prove it works, then you need to somehow try and invest more. And I'm certainly not saying the economics is easy and the budget's easy, as saying, Katie, these are hard decisions that you guys make. But if something works, then you need to continue to invest in it. And I think that the continual justification, not just of sport and physical activity, but again, as Brian was saying more broadly, the voluntary sector of sport and physical activity are good for you, we need to invest in it. Yes, we need to make sure we're monitoring, and yes, the investment needs to be justified. But we prove and we prove and we prove. And we're told we require good case studies, and then we're told we require evidence. And then we're told we require case studies, and then we're told we require evidence. And yes, social prescribing maybe does need more evidence, and very reassured to hear from Katie and colleagues that we are working towards more of that evidence. But we also spend a huge amount of time continuing to prove that sport and physical activity are just inherently good for you. Can we crack on and use that time in actually delivering the kinds of opportunities that Martin was talking about and colleagues have, rather than continually having to justify an evidence in one way or other? So I'm unclear on what that continual gap in evidence or research is. Social prescribing slightly different in that sense. We know there are so many additional benefits that are provided, and we just, I think, partly need to crack on a little bit, Convener, to be a little bit blunt about it.
Thank you very much. I think that's a point that's become very strong in the evidence, that there do appear to be two views on that question of whether we know enough. And we hear very strongly the case you've made. Can I take Katie, then Kirsty, then William Bird?
So I agree with you, Kim, but I think there is a bit of evidence that's lacking, and that's the evidence about potentially widening social inequalities in terms of your uptake and sustaining that engagement. So I think that's the bit for me which is risky in terms of putting a lot of money into the social prescribing budget until we have that evidence that we're not actually going to worsen social inequalities. I do think there's a model that's helpful that we've got a lot of experience from, which is smoking cessation and alcohol. They're both public health issues. They're both disproportionately affect people who are in a position of social deprivation. And we've got good evidence that actually you need changes from the bottom that engage people in a person-centred behaviour change fashion, but you also need changes from the top in legislation. For me, when we're talking specifically about social activity, the same applies. We do need to have good quality, evidence-based, person-centred social prescribing for those who need that level of intervention, who won't be all, who will be a proportion of those people. But we also need some legislation changes that actually help people make those changes even if they don't feel that they want to. And that really is coming into what you were talking about better cross-linking between the different departments. I fully agree. We do have an opportunity. We've declared as a government a climate emergency. What a better way to do it than using the heading of climate emergency to review how our policies actually weave across, do they deliver on that front?
So I think if I can summarise, it's not that you're arguing we need more evidence that social prescribing, that physical activity is good for you. No, it's that it's the equality aspect. Kirsty McNabb.
Just to pick up on that point, I think there is potentially a job to do with sharing the evidence that does exist. Because although we haven't had the title social prescribing, our organisation and many others like us, that is exactly what we've been doing and working with the demographic that we probably are all talking about. So there's probably a job to do in actually sharing the research that's out there. Kim mentioned Cashback for Communities organisationally. We've been part of that fund for 10 years. We're awaiting the outcome of the next round. But that is really robust evidence that's internally and externally researched, which shows that it's, you know, the impacts are lifelong and are being sustained, the changes are being sustained. So there's probably a bit of a job to do in sharing the research that already exists out there. I was actually just going to highlight there are another two resources. The Thrive Toolkit, the Scottish Government funded Physical Activity Fund, is a toolkit that's out there and available. All of the work of Drumchapel is on that toolkit. Similarly, Actify, in terms of a sector and us being able to prove the value, which is where the conversation keeps coming back to. There are resources that are out there, and I hope that colleagues in the health profession actually know that they exist and they're out there to help us move on and, as Kim said, just really get to a point where we can do this.
Thank you very much. William Bird.
I'd like to suggest one success criteria for the social prescribing, and that would be if you manage to get 50% of participants in the bottom 20% of the IMD, that we really do reach those people. Now, I think the mismatch often in conversation between health and others is that in health we see people right at the bottom end who don't go outdoors. They're locked in, often with their own children, in fear, with chronic stress, coping just about with life. And to then expect those people to start to develop sport and physical activity is asking the impossible. So those people need to be really gently into a safe place. Everything's got to come down to that housing estate where they are. They're not going to travel even 200 yards outside. It's got to have to be done. And the reality check is that there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of these people. We don't often see them in general practice because they don't even come to us. They're hidden. And they are the people where social prescribing will make a massive difference. But they're the group of people at the moment who don't touch a lot of the systems that we've put in place. They don't trust many of the systems in place. And to get those people on board is, I think, where success of social prescribing. And it's hard, and that's where the evidence, I don't think, is there yet.
Richard Davison.
I just wanted to address Kim's point about evidence. You're right, there's absolutely no doubt there's plenty of evidence about physical activity and particularly physical health, good amount about psychological health, a little bit less about the social benefits and how that interacts. But the key area that's missing is the delivery model. We have, we've known for more than 50 years since the civil service study by Jeremy Morris about the link between health and physical activity, but we haven't dramatically been able to change behaviour to get more people to be active. And we do need more information. If we think about what information do we have available to us in terms of, if you like, the health and activity of the Scottish nation, well, there's two sources. There's the Scottish Household Survey and the Scottish Health Survey. Really well-conducted surveys, but in my view, they're not necessarily asking the right questions in the right way. They are cross-sectional, they're snapshots. You have no idea about the life journey of somebody, how much activity they had when they were kids. We know that drops off massively. So that's a big area of focus. From school to early adulthood, there's a massive drop-off. What is it? Have we not been good enough in schools in terms of physical literacy, to enable people to be confident about doing their own exercise and not being forced to do it? What happens on older age? There's other countries that are better in terms of the survey information that they have. In Europe, for example, Netherlands and Denmark. And they're much better at designing policies that keep sport participation and physical activity levels high across the age group. And I think that's what we need to try and do.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll take Miles Briggs in a moment, but I'll go first to Flora Jackson, who I think would like to respond to the points about the service, but also perhaps about the wider question about the different views we're hearing about the importance of additional evidence.
Yeah, thanks very much. I've got a few points to make, if you don't mind. Really, I was just reflecting on, this notion that we don't have enough evidence, and I just want to really put that to bed. We do. We know what we need to do. We need to frankly get on and do it. For too long, we've been sitting on the back foot, maybe not willing to act. We know enough to act. We have specific NICE guidance, which, although not necessarily applicable in Scotland, is highly robust, and we have it across two areas: physical activity brief advice and exercise referral. Now, some may sit on the fence around exercise referral, but we still know enough about what works. So I think we go to that evidence, be pragmatic, because we could be forever and a day continuing to seek further and further evidence. And hence the reason it's important that we evaluate what we do, we learn from what we do, and we put in a system of improvements as we progress. We've got actions within the Health and Social Care Delivery Plan, which commits to embedding the National Physical Activity Pathway in all appropriate clinical settings by 2019. I'm conscious that 2019 is fastly approaching its end, but nonetheless, that commitment was based on an evidence base. So we know what we need to do. We can draw on learning from Public Health England and others. I know that William's been heavily involved in work around moving health professionals. The evaluation there shows that health professionals, when they raise physical activity with their patients, 1 in 4 make a change. Now that to me is a no-brainer. How can we not take forward an intervention that has such clear and compelling impacts? But what we lack here, Katie, you mentioned the smoking and alcohol agenda. We've made significant inroads there, we've made significant progress, but we've done that because we've made significant investments, not only nationally, but within local health board areas. So we have committed and dedicated staff working specifically on alcohol and smoking issues. Where do we have that for physical activity? The landscape looks dramatically different. So how can we look about readdressing and creating a landscape with the infrastructure, the resource, the staff, the expertise and the training that allows us to take the evidence that we have here and now and actually put it into practice?
Thank you very much. I think that's getting us to the heart of the issue. Miles Briggs.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning and welcome to the panel. And I wanted to follow on from a point Dr. Bird said earlier, because I think we've had a really good discussion, but it also does come back to almost the clinicalisation of reconnecting people to their communities. And I say that not just in terms of sport, but if people are the loneliness agenda, for example, and also with low-level depression and some of the mental health work going on across Scotland. So my question really is, who is actually the best gatekeeper to make this happen? Because in the evidence we had from Dr. Walter specifically, the ALICE system is what the Scottish Government say is the pathway to make this all happen and connect communities once again to some of this. You've said specifically that ALICE has been defunct in your area for some time and no one uses it. And so I know from my experience speaking to doctors, I would say half of those I've asked about ALICE haven't heard of it before. And this is us expecting this system to be in place. Now, if you know your community, you might know what's available. And I know from visits I've done to GPs in many affluent parts of the country, they know what's going on. They're part of these groups. In other parts of the country, and I think Milton is in your constituency, Bob, isn't it? Where we visited, the link workers in a GP practice are the ones who have actually had to go and start clubs, start mansheds, start community organisations. So to what extent can we make this happen on the ground? But is the GP the right gatekeeper? Because I know across Scotland, often if we do that, it takes people who have just been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes to actually firstly get into any activity. And it takes people presenting with low-level depression or loneliness. And you want to prevent that, really, in the first place. So my question is really, should we take this out of GP practices, and what does that look like?
Thanks very much, Miles. There's quite a few people who want to contribute either to respond to your question or to one or two of the immediately previous ones. But I'll take Bob first, and then Katie, and then Brian.
It's really helpful at this stage, convener, and Miles Briggs is quite right, Milton's in my constituency, and one of the real basic things I need to do is when various agencies in Milton, whether it's the Ashwell Recreation Centre, the Glasgow Club Milton, or various other groups, have activities on, I'm helping to advertise and promote them on social media. Now, people in the community still miss out on what's available, and they don't necessarily have a pathway to access the activities that are there. So even in particularly deprived low-income communities, when you have a range of activities, it doesn't mean people will go to support them. So the question I was hoping to ask is, who's mapping out some of this stuff? The example I would give in my constituency is actually in Maryhill, convener, where it's actually Deacon Jim Hamilton from the local church who takes responsibility for something called the Maryhill Activities Directory, which is every 2 years that comes out, but you get a granular perspective in every sporting opportunity, in every art opportunity, every drama opportunity, so on and so forth. So if people in that community say, what is there to do? I have at the flick of a page, and I think they've got an online portal now to access that information. So who's actually mapping out where the opportunities are in the various communities that we all represent, and then who's doing some of the monitoring around that to see how well used those opportunities are? Because that's surely got to be a starting point, convener, in relation to how we take some of that stuff forward. And I would commend what happens in Maryhill.
Comes back to the Drumchapel table tennis question. What is it that means, why is it that some things work in some places and are not happening in others? Katie Walt.
So 2 responses, first to your question and then to your question. So I sit on the Green Health Partnership, which is one of the, Highland is one of the pilot areas of the Green Health Partnership, working in conjunction, NHS and SNH together. And that's been really interesting because the first year of that, one of the tasks of the Green Health Partnership was to map out what actually exists. Alice hasn't been working in the Highlands for years. Ever since I've been a GP there, it hasn't worked. It's out of date. It's not kept updated. It's delegated to the third sector interface at local agencies to keep up to date. But because of the funding problems, because projects come and go, it very, very rapidly comes out of date, and you need funding to sustain that. So that's one of the first problems. So the mapping exercise was really interesting because I've been a GP in Inverness for quite a few years now, and I was under the impression that actually there was lots out there. Actually, when you sit down and slow down and map out, there's a lot less than people think there is. So that's one of the problems. There's not one clear repository, but even with those activities that are there, some of them then fall by the wayside. There's then the whole governance issues around those projects, of actually the quality control, governance issues, how much training there is. So it opens up a big can of worms in many ways. So I agree with you. That's a real headache and that's a real problem. And I don't know what the solution is. I'm really going to be curious to see what comes out of the Green Health Partnership pilot areas, because I think they've been left a lot of freedom to imagine what they do with that. And it may be quite interesting to see from those 4 pilot areas what comes out in terms of the mapping. In answer to your question, just very briefly about is GP the right place? It's not just the right place. For me, this is a whole systems approach. This is not just about GP surgeries, because yes, we're stressed, we're under pressure, we've got staffing issues, but we need to be having a consistent, similar message to everywhere else. So for me, this is a community-wide, it's across health and social care. It's about having a brief intervention training that is deliverable, that people feel comfortable with, that they know where they're going to then signpost on to, even if it's just some very simple low-level things that people feel confident in, so that they can just start having those discussions. But that has to be backed up at a community level in terms of having availability of those people who are then able to take on those conversations in a greater depth, in a person-centred fashion.
Thank you very much. Briefly, yeah, please.
The point I was really trying to make was, throughout the health service is obviously, quite rightly sometimes, risk aversion to actually. So if you're not using Alice, you must be referring people because you have confidence in these organisations. Now, that's when you're talking about scoping. To some extent, if you have a GP who has never been to an organisation and doesn't then want to, just in case they don't know what it's going to be like, whether or not this patient's going to be back at them, saying you sent me somewhere and actually it was a nightmare. So how do you make that more flexible and organic for communities to create that and for it to be successful without it having to be within a GP context?
You need a win-win. So all these organisations, they've got headaches. They've got headaches in terms of gathering the right evidence for their funders that then they have to deliver back to the funders. That's a headache. Nobody likes doing that. Start thinking imaginatively about how actually we support all these small organisations in terms of their data gathering in a small set of predefined criteria that are meaningful, that aren't just responding to that particular funder's whim. So make it across the board, small set of data gathering, and give them a portal in which they can do it. You then start bringing governance issues that to be able to access this easy toolkit, you have to meet these criteria. And then you start to build a kind of kite mark of these organisations are ones that are good, and you start to build a repository of those organisations.
Thank you very much. Brian Whittle.
So can I just thank you, Mr Davison, for raising the household survey, or which I would call half a household survey, because they asked the question, are you active? And they said no, and they said the question should have been, if you had access to more services, would you want to be active? Was the question I think was missing there. To your point, Convener, around why is Drumchapel Table Tennis Club working, why is Doon Valley Boxing Club working, is down to an individual. So we need to look at encourage clubs to have a succession planning. And to health inequalities, we've got to be careful with this one, because although we've been very successful in smoking and we're waiting for to see what's happening with alcohol, it was more successful in the welfare areas. So it's only half done there. And if you look at sport, in terms of access to sport, I think it's becoming the bastion of the middle classes. And we are leaving behind, and that is most evident if you look at the Olympic team. I know we're not looking at that level, but the reason that there's a third of the Olympic team come from private education of 7% of the population. So we've got to be careful looking at averages, But the question I have actually is, we're talking here about access to service and encouraging people to take access to service. And from what I'm gathering around the table here, and what I'm hearing around the table here is coming to a GP surgery with an issue and then social prescribing. My question would be, if you want to look at tackle health inequalities, if you want to level the playing field, should we be looking at social prescribing preschool and into primary school? Should that be where we start with social prescribing? Because that's where we have everybody on a level playing field.
Very much. I have Martin Hayman and William Bird.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to come back on a couple of things: access to service and also the sort of delivery model. It's a bit early to bring this in, but we've been running a pilot project called Pop In and Play, which is table tennis in a shopping centre. It's currently operating in the Gyle shopping centre in Edinburgh, utilising an empty retail space. Putting in table tennis tables and opening the door and saying, if you want to play, come in. It has been phenomenally successful. We were certainly, for the first 3 months of operation, we were averaging over 100 people a day were coming in and participating. We did some evaluation, some monitoring. Over 50% of the people who were coming in classed themselves as on the survey were inactive. So we were hitting people who were otherwise would not be doing any physical activity. And a complete age range as well. So, that was taking something as a trial, making it easy and accessible, but also opportunistic, where clearly empty retail space is not something that the country is short of, but it's getting the right opportunities to say, okay, right, let's turn that into an opportunity to access sport and take people come into the shopping centre. If you're in a shopping centre during the day, it's a real mix of backgrounds that come there. But what that offers is an opportunity to signpost. When they're involved, they're engaged, they can then be encouraged to participate in club activity. And what is really most stunning about it is as you're in there, you watch people walk past and then they kind of stop and they point. Table tennis. Is that so? And often it's an older audience, and if you've got a volunteer who immediately pops out of the door carrying a bat and said, when did you last play? And then, when I was at school, or on a family holiday, would you like to try? Shove a bat in the hand. Come on in, come on, happen. That encouragement from a volunteer is what it takes to get somebody participating and going again. Now, it's difficult to engineer that in any other environment because people wouldn't see a table tennis, wouldn't stop, wouldn't have a volunteer on hand. So I think that as a model, we're trialling it at the moment, but we think it's successful. It's something we'd like to take further. But in terms of a delivery model of how do you get people active, I think it's a positive one for the future, for sure.
Thank you very much. William Bird, you mentioned starting from the very earliest stage, and that relates directly to Brian Whittle's question. I guess the other issue that perhaps has come up a little bit is whether there are holding back factors in particular communities where kids simply aren't out in the street, or their parents choose not to have them out in the street. And,
yes,
and
well,
what
I think
the consequences
taking from Brian's point, certainly the children are, we have to start there. And in fact, there was submission from Street Games. The Street Games have been doing social prescribing for younger people, so it's very embryonic. I think we're still learning about it. If we just think about the science about this, if you're going through a very difficult situation as a child, you've got adverse childhood events, which we know create problems later on, you get chronic stress. And chronic stress makes your immune system change against you, and it causes chronic inflammation. And as a doctor, I've got no tool to deal with chronic inflammation. I've got no medicine at all. And yet chronic inflammation causes diabetes. It's a source of dementia, cardiovascular disease, and many other things. But we can measure it in children. We can measure it in children the age of 6. So children going through, in a very deprived community very often, their inflammation count would be higher, and that has the effect which will mean that they'll live a less long life and they'll have more disease later on. So we have to deal at this early age. Doesn't mean we stop doing at adult right across the life course. But also, it means that we have to go back into education. So social prescribing shouldn't just be with the primary care.
I'm having trouble with the connection. Please try again in a moment.
So it should be also, teachers should be doing social prescribing. We should be getting employers with their workforce, hairdressers with their clients. Everyone should be doing this work, and it comes right down to anyone in contact with children should be doing the social prescribing and understanding it. But as a doctor, if I have someone with iron deficiency, I give them iron. If they're thyroxine deficiency, I give them thyroxine. It doesn't quite work with physical activity. If they're deprived of physical activity, you don't just slap physical activity onto them. Physical activity is an outcome of a better life. So if you create a social environment, and as we've been hearing probably from table tennis, it just happens that sport just happens to have physical activity as part of its armoury, but it is all the social. So a happier society is a more active society without ever mentioning the word physical activity. And I think we've got to really stop using physical activity as a cure for inactivity, because actually that's not the way round. It's the medical model, but it doesn't work. We have to create a better society, a more connected society. So I think what we should be really saying is challenging social prescribing will lead to more activity without ever mentioning that word. We have to start it very early on, and we have to look at the understanding that we've got this problem of chronic inflammation, which we now know is so majorly divisive in people from inequalities that it's causing most of the problems. The only armour we've got is connection to individuals, so people are not lonely and they're connected to each other. They've got a place where they feel safe and they feel that they belong, and they've got purpose in their life and they feel they've got some control. And if we reach those three things, then we can actually deliver a much, much healthier society across the board. And social prescribing has got the energy and the wherewithal to do it, but at a much wider level than just health professionals.
Thank you very much. Take Kirsty McNabb, and then I think David Torrance wanted to come in on the equalities issue. Kirsty McNabb.
Just to pick up on William's point about adverse childhood experiences and trauma, sport has actually been proven to help reduce all the stresses and the anxieties of the physical and the mental things that go alongside young people who are experiencing adverse childhood experiences, because it will discharge cortisol. So again, organisations like ours working in communities where we train up young people to be peer mentors and role models, having activity in areas where young people are, so within 100 metres of where they're actually living, and who are trained to be trauma aware. Sometimes it's not even about the activity, so we look at really physical activity in its widest sense. Sometimes it really is just about that, getting them out the house and having a chat with them before they can progress on to anything that we would recognise as sport. So again, just advocating that we have all the robust monitoring and evaluation that goes alongside the success of those types of programmes. And it's not just us, but other voluntary sector organisations who are using sport are becoming much more aware of what's actually happening physiologically for young people who are living in stress.
Thank you very much. David Torrance.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, everybody. Should resources and initiatives be targeted at our most deprived communities who have the greatest health inequalities, or should that resource follow the individual?
Community-based or individual-based? I guess we've covered some of that already this morning, but Kirsty, I don't know if you wanted to respond.
I mean, it has to be both. Organisationally, again, because we have to prove our existence or justify our existence, we look very crudely at the index of multiple deprivation, but just because you live in a postcode that is not in an index of multiple deprivation doesn't mean that you don't need support, because you can be isolated in many different communities. So I think it goes back to what we've all been talking about, but Katie mentioned it's person-centred. It's actually understanding individuals and individuals' needs. So, that's quite a difficult thing to do, because there has to be some type of measure, and right now index of multiple deprivation is the measure that many of us use, but there definitely has to be both, and actually understanding people, not just looking at their postcode.
Is it anybody? Can I just come back to the hardest, getting somebody to be active is that first step. How do we actually get somebody to do that? Because I know when I went to the doctor and he says, look, David, you're borderline type 2 diabetes, go lose a bit of weight, become active. And it was easy for me. I went to Walton Football Club, which is supported by my football club, which was a Hearty community. And now put on record that we're Scottish champions. But it is very, because it's at a Hearty community, there are a lot of people, middle-aged men, all go there who are inactive now doing it. But how do you get these individuals, especially in, it doesn't need to just be deprived communities, get them to take that first step? How do we guide them there? Because it's okay saying, look, there's always different activities in the area. The hardest bit is actually taking that first step and going and doing it.
To answer that, I think again it's understanding what actually individuals want to do, and I talked about this in my response, but just because we're all advocates of sport and physical activity and all the health benefits, for many people that actually won't be a motivational factor. So there's no one answer. It has to be dependent on what people are interested in. So is it getting out in the community? A lot of our young people really are interested in making a difference in their own community, so volunteering is the thing that actually gets them through the door. So I don't think there's one answer. It has to be an individual. What are people interested in? What is it they want to do? Is it somebody else that can take them there? Is it about making new friends? Is it about finding something positive to do in their own community? It'll depend on the individual, I think.
Thank you very much. Emma Harper.
Just interested in looking at the sustainability aspects of it, and David talked about type 2 diabetes. In front of me, I'm reading that type 2 numbers are going to increase. It looks like NHS Scotland spend £1 billion each year on type 2 diabetes, and £800 million is spent treating potentially avoidable complications. 12% of the inpatient budget treats diabetes complications. So as a type 1 diabetic, I know a lot of type 2 diabetics as well, but how do you behaviourally change those kind of folks that, we know we need to signpost them to maybe do some more walking or some more exercise? And then how do we then look at what budget savings is going to be achieved by avoiding all these complications in the first place? And then where do we then pick apart the budgets? We've talked about the budget coming from transport or other areas. For instance, First Minister talks about climate change isn't just a climate change committee's remit. It's everybody. Every portfolio has to talk about climate change. So now we're talking about health and well-being and supporting people. So every portfolio needs to talk about how do we support people's health and well-being, which includes physical activity and sport. So lots of kind of questions and thoughts around there, but I'm interested in particularly the type 2 diabetic folk and how do we engage them in physical activity.
Lots of questions, but sadly less time than we could use. What I'll do is I'll take from a question from Miles as well. Then I've got Kim and Katie, and maybe get round the table with a final consideration.
Very brief question, and it's followed on from what Kirsty McNabb said, and I won't rehearse some of the arguments I've put about opening up the school estate and the fact that it's not, but that's on the record. Do the panel think that teachers should be able to social prescribe then, in terms of someone who's, especially children, young people who aren't going to be necessarily presenting at a GP surgery, and that could look very exciting, very different, and open up lots of additional capacity potentially?
Point, absolutely. We do a lot of our early intervention with schools, so actually we're getting more referrals from schools than from healthcare professionals. So yes, I think that needs to be something across the board that is done. And yes, please open up the school estates.
Yes.
Is there a medical professional willing to endorse that approach? Katie, well.
Absolutely. They lead for children. They are the lead professionals for children in education age. So therefore, they have a key responsibility in taking on this role.
Kim Atkinson.
Absolutely to the teachers and absolutely to the school estate. If there's a vote on that, convener, I would hope that the committee would be receptive in that sense. I think it goes back to Katie's point about this being everybody's responsibility, and I think that holistic support is a key opportunity within that. I think in part answer to Emma's point, I think part of it's locality. So again, the school estate, you can't keep coming back to it, but again, the local aspect of clubs where people have their own parks and they can go walking and a range of things, locality is a part of it. And it's mapping to the motivations, which again I know is something that Kirsty talked about. So I don't think it's simple, but it's a dialogue. It's starting that conversation. It goes back to Flora's point and saying, was that 1 in 4 interventions, if they're recommended by a GP, then they happen? Is there a better fact that the committee could hear today in support of social prescribing? I would certainly question, convener. I think we've talked a little bit about resource. It has to be new resource. This can't be about continuing to do more with less. And I know that's not an easy question, and every organisation that comes and every entity will be saying that. But we can't continue to be doing more with less, considering, again, we're talking about so often voluntary sector organisations being the people who are not seeing any money coming as a result of that, but we're expecting to do the delivery. We've talked a little bit about disadvantaged groups. I'm conscious we haven't really spoken perhaps so much about people with a disability, which I think is really important. So again, around that holistic support, our members at Scottish Disability Sport were quoting some figures to us that were saying that 47% of people who are in receipt of benefits are concerned that if they're seen to take part in sport or physical activity, they might have their benefits cut. So again, around that holistic support, again, there are some barriers we need to make sure that I'm sure they're perceived barriers than real barriers, but again, we need to work through. In some conversations with our colleagues in the NHS the other day, they were saying that actually across a wide range of interventions, they were talking about the ones that relate to sport and physical activity as being the most cost effective. Appreciate that. That's a myriad of interventions there. But again, in terms of having success, but also being most cost effective, I think is something that should be important to the committee. But again, coming back to that idea of partnership working that we've heard so much, the table tennis model is amazing. If you haven't been in the Gyle, go guys, honestly, it's incredible looking at it. But again, that innovation in saying we've got space. There are, as you say, unused shops throughout communities. We so often hear about the challenge that local towns are facing. Great. Let's get a range of clubs. It's something that I know Martin's keen to come and talk to a wide range of our governing bodies and say, let's be innovative. What an amazing example. Let's go and do it. Echoed also by some amazing work that table tennis are doing in care homes. So there are so many different things that we can do if there's a little bit of time for some of that innovation. Walking football. Did you say you were the champions? Did I miss that earlier, David? But again, there are, I guess that's where sports clubs and sports governing bodies really are trying to be innovative and different, but they're continually doing more with less. And that just doesn't continue to be sustainable. So we have those opportunities. And I think, again, going back to your point, Emma, the buddy system, I mentioned Atlantis Leisure earlier. One of the things that they do as part of their model is somebody goes with them. They find out what it is that person wants to do. And they say, I'll come with you, Emma. You've not been along. I'll come with you for a few sessions till you know people, till you get a sense that that's the activity for you. And then great, you're happy to go on your own and you can go and do that. So again, like we were saying, there's practice out there that we can reflect, but we need to be a bit brave and bold and say, yes, we need to invest, but if it's the right thing to invest in, then let's crack on.
Thank you very much. My final question for any of the witnesses who wish to offer an answer is there one thing we need to do to take this agenda forward and to make a difference? One major thing that would make the biggest difference at this point in time? Richard Davison.
It's been mentioned a couple of times as resource, and I think, it's about the economic impact of this, because, Emma quite rightly quoted the statistics. They're quite frightening, and the cost to the NHS is quite frightening. It's a problem that's solvable. That's the key thing, and this is one solution. But the problem with it is social prescribing is for people who are already ill, but of course we know we can help them. We want to try and stop them get ill. And we've had a mention of social prescribing in schools. I don't like that term. How about lifestyle coaching? And let's develop a healthy lifestyle. And that would be what we need to communicate to our children.
Thank you very much. Corinne Jola.
Yes. I come back to what I said at the very beginning. For me, it's really using the opportunities that social prescribing or lifetime coaching give. There are views that, yes, we know physical activity is good for your health, but which physical activity is best for an individual who suffers from long-term mental or physical illness? We don't know exactly. So while rolling out more the social prescribing, linking with the research communities who can gather more evidence base to better understand how to approach different groups and different individuals with different needs best.
Thank you very much. William Bird.
I think social prescribing, as we've discussed it in its narrow sense, has to fit in that wider social aspect, the whole community aspect. I think we've come across that consensus. I'd say that's probably the most important thing. With my other hat also, we're delivering things called an intervention called Beat the Street, where we've over 100,000 people from Scotland have actually taken part in the most deprived communities. And it's possible to get people from the very deprived communities to start to see above the parapet and to start to see life being a bit better and to start to experience the parks and the green spaces and to start to explore around their area. And it's giving them that safety. So I think it has to hand in hand with a community intervention. And I think one example of a lady on a health walk in Scotland who was bereaved and she was very depressed. She started developing hypertension and arthritis of her hips and she became housebound. And a friend said, you must come out. And after a year, she came out to the first health walk, but she made the tea. And she made the tea for every health walk for the next 6 months and never actually walked, just carried on making the tea. At 6 months, she had the confidence to go on that first walk. And then she carried on every week with a walk. Then after a year, she became a health walk leader. And then she became the most successful health walk leader at the age of 82. Now that journey of that person from complete dissolution, she was going to be sliding down to become one of our health statistics. The time it took for her to get that confidence, we never underestimate. And as you're saying, starting where people are and moving them up. And for her, it was totally the social aspect. It wasn't the walking, it was a social aspect that got her there.
Thank you very much. Katie Walter.
I think to you as a cohort of politicians, I'd ask you to really talk to each other and talk to other departments, because I think this is not just a systems approach across health and social care and sport. I think it's across government as well. And I think using the thread of climate change is a really helpful one, because it will actually really focus down what are the changes that we can afford and what are the changes that we can't afford. I think resource, you were quoting the figures around diabetes locally in NHS Highland. 4 million is spent every year on drugs for diabetes, and that's 10% of the drugs budget. That's an enormous amount of money. And actually, if you start thinking about what would happen if you started reallocating some of the NHS money back towards primary care and investing in primary care in its broader sense, then you start to potentially unlock some actually quite interesting things that could happen if you start to manage to demedicalise some of these conditions.
Thank you very much. Claire Thurwell.
Yeah, just following on from Dr. Walter, just to say I would probably advocate that we invest in our culture change across our systems, our culture change with our individuals about what they expect in terms of our services to kind of embrace those self-management approaches in terms of access to our sport and physical activity. Also culture change across our systems to kind of demedicalise, following from what you've said there, and also a bit of culture change within our communities so that we're actually working with our communities to kind of ensure that they have properly supported and resourced.
Martin.
I think if we're going to deliver the sort of change that we need, we've got to make it fun. People have got to enjoy it. And I think a great example of that is I took a camera team into a sheltered housing setting with a brief to give me a 5-minute film on table tennis in a sheltered housing environment. And the cameraman came back to me afterwards and said, I've not got you 5 minutes of table tennis, but I've got half an hour of people laughing. And he showed me the footage, and every now and again a ball went past and you could see bats in hands, but almost the table was irrelevant. They had created the environment that everybody who was there was laughing, everybody was participating and enjoying themselves. And that's what was important. And those people come back, and those people come back every week because it's fun.
Thank you very much. Kirsty McNabb and Kim Ackmans.
Everything that everyone else said, resource, the cross-directorate working, but also some real people. So the stories we've just heard, a working group of people. I mean, we've just got a youth advisory board and it's the best thing I ever done as an organisation. We're truly youth-led. So a group of real people who can help move this forward.
And lastly, just again, as Kirsty was saying, I agree with everybody else, that we see sport and physical activity as an investment and not a cost. So our former chief medical officer said it was the best investment in public health. And you speak to GPs who say this is the miracle cure. If it was a tablet, we'd all be rich. It's an investment, not a cost.
Can I say thank you very much to all of our witnesses. That's been a very stimulating and informative discussion. And I'm sure we will want to follow up on many of the points that have been raised and discussed this morning. We'll now suspend briefly for 5 minutes to allow our witnesses to leave, and we will continue in public session in 5 minutes' time.
Thank you very much.
The next item on our agenda is consideration of 4 outstanding petitions. The first of these is PE 1568 in the name of Catherine Hughes on funding, access and promotion of the NHS Centre for Integrative Care. This has been, as will be evident from the note by the clerk, which has been made available today to the public. This has been discussed in some length and in some detail by both the Public Petitions Committee and then more recently by this committee. And one of the central requests of the petition is for the designation of the Centre for Integrative Care as a national resource. Ministers have been asked that question directly and have confirmed that that is not a decision for them. However, it may be that we're able to explore this in a different way. I wonder if I could invite any comments from members. David Stewart, followed by Miles Briggs.
I think many members will agree this is, I think, an excellent petition, and I think if my memory serves me right, I was still in the Petitions Committee with David and Sandra at that time, and I was very impressed with the strength of the petition at that stage. I think many people, I think we were contacted by Dorothy Grace Elder, who's been an excellent advocate for the petition. And there's one thing, Convener, I was particularly interested in. We've raised many times the opioid crisis in this committee, and I would be particularly interested to see if we could ask the Chief Medical Officer and Government why aren't they seeking the NHS CIC expertise in this particular area, because clearly it's a very, very worrying trend, not quite to the American levels, but clearly it's a trend that we need to look at. So without making a judgment on next steps in the petition, I think there's some follow-up questions that I would ask the committee to forward on.
Thank you very much. Miles Briggs.
Thank you, Convener, and I agree with what David Stewart has said. I think this petition continues to be an important vehicle to try to progress reform and improvements for patients with chronic pain across Scotland. I co-chair our cross-party group here in the Parliament, and I have to say, for most people who attend that, they feel for 10 years they've just been sent round the doors of the health service, and with the changes to CIC, that's made things even worse. So I'd like to pay tribute to Catherine Hughes, who's in the public gallery, for this petition being brought forward. And I think there's opportunities now to take this forward. I was particularly concerned with the response we'd had from Jane Grant. I don't think it really was a response, specifically looking towards just saying that people who are able to access services are happy enough with them. The whole point is that people aren't able to access many chronic pain services. So I think we need to turn that argument on its head and look towards what the government actually wants to do for chronic pain patients across Scotland. And there's an opportunity there for us to really progress that, and especially with regards to the government's targets and spend around waiting times. I think we need to look towards where chronic patients fit into that argument. So I'd like us to keep this petition open and really see it as a vehicle to continue to make progress around this.
Thank you very much. Emma Harper.
Thank you, Convener. In my local work, I've got a group of people that have myalgic encephalitis, and a lot of those patients do have chronic fatigue but have pain management issues as well. So I think if we're looking at how are those patients being served locally, nationally as well, it would be worth keeping certain patient populations that maybe don't have access to certain care as well within this remit as well, and I'd be keen to see how that's followed up.
Thank you very much. I think there have been a couple of questions asked and a couple of points made, and I've seen no dissent from any of those points. If we are agreed that we should keep the petition open, it does seem to me that the gap in what we know is around whether the designation of CIC as a national service could be carried forward by the NHS itself. And I would therefore suggest that we write to NHS National Services Division to ask for their opinion on the suitability of CIC to be a national service and whether it could be considered by their relevant committee. Is that something to which members are agreed? I think that takes us forward. I also think David Stewart's point around asking the CMO, I think a general question around addressing the opioid issue and whether the CIC is one of the services which may be called upon to give advice or make an input to that seems a sensible one. Separately, I think slightly from the consideration of the petition, but something that I think the petition encourages to do. Is that also agreed? Thank you very much. We'll move on then to the petition PEO 1605 in the name of Peter Gregson on behalf of Kids Not Suits on whistleblowing in the NHS. Again, the public papers spell out the previous work the committee has conducted on this, and in particular the work that the committee has done in relation to the government's proposed changes around whistleblowing in the NHS. Can I ask if members have any comments they wish to make in the first instance on that? Miles Briggs.
Thank you, Convener. I think in terms of where this petition's been going, there's some key issues still, I think, from the government has acted and brought forward plans. But around the whole consultation, around what the future will look like for people who are put in a position where they want to whistleblow, I don't think has really included them in what that looks like. And I think that's really where the petitioner has been trying to see more progress being made. So I would like to see more consultation taking place onto some of the questions which continue to be asked over the role and the future role, certainly, of SPSO and how they will investigate, and also how they will actually in the future be able to have a reporting mechanism and hear these concerns from whistleblowers. So I think that would actually help to progress some of the principles which the petitioner has brought forward.
Thank you very much. David Stewart.
I would support the comments that Miles Briggs made. Members will know I've had a particular interest in whistleblowing following the allegations of bullying in Highland Health Board, which we put directly to the board, as you know, Convener, some months ago. I mean, I support the INWO, which has been set up at the SPSO, but I think the issue that Peter Gregson made is how is the SPSO going to investigate whistleblowing concerns? How will she actually hear them directly? So I think there is a good mechanism, and I know we looked at this. I'm just a little bit concerned about the little bit of the gap between people having whistleblowing allegations to make and how the SPSO is going to actually hear about them. So just the system I would like more clarity on.
Okay, Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Convener. Again, I would support what my colleagues have said today. I have a specific interest around bullying within the Scottish Ambulance Service, having had quite a few of my surgeries which have been attended, and the issue seems to be to a point where they're not willing to whistleblow anymore because of the repercussions. So I think I would really be interested in looking at how that process is going to work to give any potential whistleblower the confidence to come forward, and how the government plan to monitor the impact of sort of the new ideas being brought forward around whistleblowing, because if the outcome is, as it currently seems to stand with the people that are attending my surgeries, is they will not whistleblow because of the repercussions, then the system is not working.
Emma Harper.
Well, I would be keen to just continue to follow up how the whistleblowing process or the leadership around it and the local whistleblowing champions, how they will action or deal with issues that are raised. I know the petitioner had particular issues around clinical front-facing access, or how do we help support people who may choose to whistleblow. I know that the Cabinet Secretary was keen that with the way that we move forward with processes of engagement with leadership, that ultimately we shouldn't need a whistleblower in the first place if people feel comfortable about sharing. But I recognise that there's been issues that have been raised by colleagues, Ambulance Service, as well as NHS Highlands, and other local issues that have been brought to my attention as well. I'd be really keen to see how the whole process is monitored and supported.
Okay, thanks. I think that's very helpful. Colleagues will recall that the committee considered many of these questions at the time in May, when we issued a short call for views, and we got evidence and indeed had an oral evidence session on how the Independent National Whistleblowing Officer would work in the context of Scottish Public Services Ombudsman and the structure. And I think to go back to the aspiration that of the Cabinet Secretary, which Emma Harper mentioned, it reminds me that when the NHS was first founded, we thought that Our predecessors thought that once it had done its job for a generation, it wouldn't be needed anymore. I suspect whistleblowing will always be essential, no matter how well run our public services are. I guess our job is to make sure that we are confident that people who do have whistleblowing concerns are able to raise them. The last order that the government has brought forward to implement its new system of whistleblowing has now been laid, and we have a fortnight in which we can consult on that, which I think would allow some of the questions members have highlighted to be asked. I would also suggest that at the end of that process, when we come to consider the order and decide whether or not we approve that order, we could take that opportunity to invite the Independent National Whistleblowing Officer to come here and answer those questions directly. And perhaps that would then allow some transparency and confidence that those questions had indeed been answered. My suggestion would be that if at that point we are satisfied with what we hear and we agree that the order should be approved, we could then consider this petition closed, because then the things that it was specifically launched to raise will have been addressed, and if the committee is satisfied with the government's response, then that, I think, closes that chapter. It will, though I fear, as I say, never be a book that's closed. There will always be issues around whistleblowing that will come up. But I think in terms of the specific points in this petition, hopefully the conclusion of this process will allow us to close that petition. Is that an approach with which members are content? That is agreed. Thank you very much. The third petition is in the name of Karen Murphy, Jane Rentoul, David Wilkie, Louisa Rogers and Jennifer Jane Lee on medical care in rural areas, which relates in part to the new contract agreement in relation to general practitioners. We took evidence as part of our primary care inquiry on the 1st of October, as members will recall, both from the Rural GP Association and from the Rural and Remote Patients Group, which clearly relate directly to the matters raised within this petition. Can I ask for any comments members may have in relation to this petition? Miles Briggs.
Specific point, I don't think necessarily it's in direct relation to what the petitioners have been looking towards, but the Health Secretary has been on record saying she recognises some of the concerns around the GP contract for rural communities, and be that in terms of continuing to provide vaccination to the communities they serve, etc. And I just think it would be quite useful to see where the Scottish Government actually are in the future, as we see the stage 2 or phase 2 of the contract negotiated, and whether or not what she said is almost a version for rural GPs being included in that, to actually almost separate that, and if that's going to take place, 'cause I think that might actually in the future pick up on many of the points which the petitioners originally raised, if that's going to happen in phase 2 of the GP contract.
One would imagine, it would appear likely that that would be the kind of issue to be addressed. I guess the question for this committee is whether this petition is a necessary vehicle for that to happen, or whether we can encompass the questions that are raised in this petition within our primary care inquiry report, and therefore close this petition, but of course come back to the wider issues that it raises in due course. Is that something to which members are agreed?
Yep, I think so. I am keen, as an MSP who represents a rural region, I'm really keen to follow the process in our primary care inquiry about how we can promote equality within the healthcare, whether it's rural or urban. And it would be interesting to see if all the points within this petition are encompassed within our primary care inquiry.
I think that's sensible. On the proviso that we ensure that we do encompass those matters within the inquiry, are we content to close this petition? That is agreed. Thank you very much. The fourth and final petition for consideration this morning is PEO 1533 in the name of Jeff Adamson on behalf of Scotland Against the Care Tax on the abolition of non-residential social care charges for older and disabled people. I think we have already agreed as a committee that we will consider social care within a future inquiry in the course of 2020. I would therefore recommend, if colleagues are agreed, that this petition be again subsumed within that inquiry, and it's we treat it as an item of evidence for that inquiry. But in the meantime, as a petition, we close the petition at this stage. Is that something to which members are agreed, or are there other comments members wish to make? Emma Harper.
Thank you. As long as subsumed doesn't mean that it's made any less important, so we need to make sure that the petitioners are kept well informed about our inquiry as we move forward.
Indeed, let's make sure that we will make sure that happens and that they are fully informed. Thank you very much, colleague. That concludes that agenda item. Agenda item 6 is consideration of a legislative consent memorandum related to the Birmingham Commonwealth Games Bill. Part 3 of the bill relates to areas which fall within the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament, and we need to agree or not as to whether those areas of devolved competence should be considered by the UK Parliament in that bill. It provides the legal basis for certain time-limited operational measures in support of the Games in areas such as funding, ticket touting, advertising and trading and transport. And the provisions within the bill follow from precedents in the bills relating to the London Olympics in 2012 and the Glasgow Commonwealth Games in 2014. Can I ask if members have any comments on the LCM that they wish to make at this stage? If not, is the committee content with this legislative consent motion and with the Scottish Government's view that the Scottish Parliament should consent to the UK Parliament legislating in this area? That is agreed. Thank you very much, and the committee will report to Parliament on that basis. We will now move into private session. Thank you very much.